Armed monks entered Egypt not as pilgrims, but as soldiers. They came under the cross, carrying vows of poverty and obedience, yet marching into one of the richest and most ancient lands the medieval world had ever imagined. Behind them stood Jerusalem. Before them stood the Nile. And somewhere between Crusader ambition and Egyptian reality, a rumor began to grow. What did the Templars truly encounter there? Treasure, sacred relics, military secrets, forbidden knowledge? Or did Egypt offer them something far more dangerous? Proof that holy confidence could be swallowed by sand, river, hunger, and time? To follow that question, we have to move slowly, not into fantasy first, but into history. Because the legend of the Templars in Egypt did not begin with hidden chambers or lost gold. It began with armies, strategy, fear, and the hard mathematics of power. This is a story about a door beneath the sand, not necessarily a literal door, though later centuries would certainly enjoy imagining one. It is the doorway between what can be documented and what people desperately wanted to believe. The Knights Templar were real. Their campaigns in Egypt were real. Their losses were real. But around those facts, something stranger gathered. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because Egypt did not simply appear in the Templar story as a battlefield. It became a mirror. And what the Order saw there may explain why, long after the armies withdrew, the rumors refused to die. To understand why the Templars marched into Egypt, we have to set aside a simple mistake. Modern eyes often imagine the Crusades as a straight road to Jerusalem, a sacred city, a holy objective, the final prize. And of course, Jerusalem mattered enormously. It mattered emotionally, theologically, symbolically. It was the city named in sermons, prayers, donations, and vows. It was the place that could make kings kneel and peasants sell what little they had to take up the cross. But strategy has a colder memory than devotion. By the early 13th century, many Crusader leaders had begun to understand that holding Jerusalem was not only a matter of capturing walls, it was a matter of sustaining power in a region where money, food, cavalry, ships, intelligence, and alliances mattered as much as relics and banners. A city could be taken in a season and lost in another. To hold the Holy Land, the Crusader states needed more than courage. They needed leverage. And Egypt was leverage. It was not a scenic detour on the way to Jerusalem. It was the engine room behind much of the power that opposed the Crusader states. Its fields were fed by the Nile. Its cities were tied into Mediterranean and Red Sea trade. Its rulers could draw revenue from agriculture, commerce, and taxation on a scale that the smaller Crusader territories could not easily match. Egypt was not merely rich in the vague way distant lands become rich in the imagination. It was rich in grain, administration, manpower, and strategic position. That mattered. A Crusader kingdom along the coast of the Levant could survive for a time through fortresses, ports, and help from Europe. But it existed under pressure. It depended on reinforcements that might arrive late, or not at all. It depended on naval routes vulnerable to storms, politics, and the changing interests of Italian merchant cities. It depended on leaders who were often divided by rank, pride, inheritance, and theology. Against that, Egypt offered something the Crusader states badly lacked: depth. Depth is an unromantic word, but it changes wars. A shallow kingdom can win a battle and still be exhausted. A deep power can lose a battle and recover. Egypt had space to retreat into, resources to tax, canals and rivers to shape movement, and cities whose fall would not necessarily mean the collapse of the entire state. To Crusader strategists, this made Egypt both terrifying and tempting. If it remained in Muslim hands, it could support campaigns into Syria and Palestine. If it fell to the Crusaders, then the balance of the Eastern Mediterranean might tilt. This was the logic that made Egypt look like the prize behind the prize. The idea was not simply, take Egypt, then take Jerusalem. It was more ambitious than that. Egypt could be used as a bargaining piece, a base, a source of wealth, and a way to break the political structure that held Crusader ambitions in check. Jerusalem was the sacred wound. Egypt was the hand pressing on it. And there was another layer, less practical but no less powerful. Egypt carried an ancient weight in the Christian imagination. It was the land of Pharaoh, of Moses, of exile, plague, and deliverance. It was the place where biblical memory and living Islamic power overlapped in ways that could feel almost unbearable to medieval crusaders. Marching into Egypt was not like marching into an ordinary province. It meant stepping into a landscape already crowded with scripture. That does not mean Crusader leaders were chasing pyramids or secret temples. We have to be careful here, because later legend loves to drag the Templars into every ancient shadow it can find. The documented military campaigns were aimed at real cities, real rulers, and real political outcomes. Yet it is still important to understand the atmosphere. Egypt was not just strategically valuable, it was psychologically charged. To invade it was to enter a place where sacred history, imperial ambition, and material wealth seemed to speak at once. For the Knights Templar, that mixture would have been familiar and dangerous. They were not wandering adventurers. They were not treasure hunters in the modern sense. They were disciplined participants in Crusader warfare, bound to a religious mission and deeply embedded in the political world of the Latin East. When Crusader strategy turned toward Egypt, the Templars did not stand outside that logic. They helped carry it forward. And yet Egypt was different from the roads of Palestine or the fortresses of Syria. It was flatter, wetter, wider, more deceptive. The Nile Delta could turn movement into confusion. Canals could become barriers. Flooding could remake the battlefield without asking permission from either pope or prince. In the desert imagination of crusading Europe, Egypt might appear as a treasure house waiting to be opened. On the ground, it was a system, environmental, military, administrative, and systems are much harder to conquer than cities. That is one of the details people often miss. The Crusaders did not fail in Egypt because they lacked bravery. They failed again and again because bravery was not enough. The Templars, perhaps more than most, understood the value of discipline, logistics, and fortification. But even they were entering a theater where local knowledge mattered immensely. The Nile did not care about vows. Disease did not care about banners. Supply lines did not become shorter because the cause was holy. Egypt forced Crusader ambition to become practical. It asked questions that sermons could not answer. How do you feed an army in a flooded delta? How do you coordinate rival leaders far from the coastal bases that support them? How do you hold a captured city when the enemy still controls the river, the countryside, and the rhythm of the land itself? How do you turn symbolic victory into durable power? In Jerusalem, the Crusaders could imagine themselves standing at the center of the Christian world. In Egypt, they faced the machinery that made their enemies resilient. This is why Egypt became so central to Crusader planning. Not because Jerusalem had lost its meaning, but because Jerusalem had become impossible to think about honestly without Egypt. The road to the Holy City no longer ran only through prayer, siege towers, and cavalry charges. It ran through grain stores, tax systems, naval supply, diplomacy, and the flood cycle of a river older than every kingdom fighting over it. So when the armed monks crossed into Egypt, they were entering more than enemy territory. They were entering the hard truth behind medieval holy war. Faith could inspire an invasion, but it could not by itself solve geography. And Egypt, patient and immense, was waiting to teach that lesson. The Knights Templar began with a narrow purpose, or at least that is how their story is usually told. They were supposed to protect pilgrims. That image is simple enough to survive almost any retelling. A small brotherhood of armed men, sworn to defend vulnerable travelers on the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. It is a powerful beginning because it sounds humble. A few knights, a holy mission, a road between fear and devotion. No palaces, no treasure vaults, no international banking networks, no rumors of secret rites. Just danger, discipline, and faith, with a sword in its hand. But institutions rarely remain the size of their founding purpose. The Templars grew because the world around them required them to grow. The Crusader states were fragile creations, stretched along the eastern Mediterranean coastline, dependent on castles, ports, alliances, and reinforcements from faraway Europe. A pilgrim road could not be protected without controlling territory. Territory could not be controlled without fortresses. Fortresses required money, men, horses, supplies, political influence, and coordination across borders. So the order that began by guarding roads became something much larger, a military religious machine. That combination is still difficult to fully grasp. The Templars were monks, but not cloistered monks. They took vows, lived under rule, prayed, obeyed superiors, and were expected to submit their individual will to the discipline of the order. Yet their work was not withdrawal from the world. Their work was war. They were trained to fight, to hold positions under pressure, to endure siege and campaign, to make violence part of religious obedience. This made them unusual even in their own time. A secular knight might fight for land, inheritance, reputation, ransom, or loyalty to a lord. A Templar knight was supposed to fight as an act of service. Whether every man lived up to that ideal is another matter. Human beings have a way of bringing vanity into even the strictest systems. But the ideal mattered. It gave the order a kind of terrifying clarity. A Templar was not meant to retreat for personal survival if obedience required him to stand. He was not supposed to pursue private glory if the order demanded restraint. He belonged to a collective identity, and collective identities are powerful. Over time, the Templars became one of the most disciplined and recognizable forces in Crusader warfare. They built and managed castles. They moved money. They advised rulers. They negotiated. They fought in the field and held positions on the frontier. Their houses in Europe supported their work in the East, gathering donations, estates, revenues, and recruits. Wealth flowed towards them because people believed supporting the order was a way to participate in holy struggle without personally crossing the sea. This is where the later legends find their first opening. Because the Templars were wealthy, people imagined they must have been hiding something. Because they were disciplined, people imagined they must have known something. Because they were religious yet military, public yet internally closed, people found them easy to distrust. And because their records were incomplete, and their inner life was not fully visible to outsiders, later centuries had room to build entire palaces of speculation on small foundations of fact. But we should not let the myth swallow the more interesting reality. The Templars did not need hidden treasure to become powerful. Their strength came from organization. In a medieval world, where authority was often personal, local, and unstable, the order had continuity. A king could die. A baron could change sides. A crusading army could arrive full of enthusiasm and then dissolve when supplies ran out. The Templars, by contrast, were designed to remain. Their leadership might change, their fortunes might rise or fall, but the institution had memory. That memory mattered in Egypt. When Crusader councils debated strategy, the Templars were not merely background muscle. They were among the groups with experience in the region, knowledge of warfare, and a direct stake in the survival of the Latin East. They understood that military decisions were rarely pure acts of faith. They involved roads, rivers, ports, fortresses, timing, ships, horses, and grain. A foolish campaign could kill more than an army. It could weaken the entire Christian position in the East for years. Yet the order was also caught inside the same spiritual pressure as everyone else. They existed to serve the crusading cause. If the wider movement turned toward Egypt, they could not simply shrug and become detached analysts. They were soldiers of a holy enterprise. Their discipline made them valuable, but it also bound them to campaigns shaped by ambition, papal pressure, royal pride, and the dangerous belief that God's will could be read in military opportunity. This is one of the contradictions at the heart of the Templar story. They were practical men inside an impractical dream. They knew the cost of horses, the weakness of supply lines, the importance of fortified positions. They had seen crusading enthusiasm collide with disease, heat, hunger, and bad leadership. But they also belonged to a movement that interpreted war through salvation history. A victory could look like divine favor. A defeat could be explained as punishment, impurity, or insufficient faith. In that mental world, caution was not always admired. Sometimes caution sounded too much like doubt. So when Egypt became the strategic obsession behind Jerusalem, the Templars entered the story as more than warriors in white mantles. They were carriers of institutional experience. They had influence in councils and on battlefields. They could lend legitimacy to a plan, resist it, or shape its execution. Their presence told others that the campaign was not only a royal adventure or a passing enthusiasm. It belonged to the serious business of Crusader survival. And still, they were not all powerful. That point is worth holding on to. Later legend often imagines the Templars as puppet masters behind medieval events, quietly steering kings and popes from hidden chambers. The truth is less theatrical and more revealing. They were influential, yes, respected often, feared sometimes, resented certainly, but they operated inside a crowded political world. Kings, bishops, papal legates, local barons, rival military orders, Italian merchants, and Muslim rulers whose own diplomacy could be subtle and divided. The Templars could shape decisions, but they could also be trapped by them. In Egypt, that distinction becomes crucial. The order's discipline did not guarantee wise strategy. Its courage did not guarantee victory. Its secrecy did not conceal a master plan capable of bending the Nile to Crusader desire. If anything, Egypt exposed the limits of even the most formidable crusading institutions. It showed that an order built for endurance could still be drawn into campaigns where the wider plan was flawed from the beginning. And this may be why the Templars remain so compelling. They stood at the meeting point of faith and force, humility and wealth, service and power. They were visible enough to become famous, but closed enough to become mysterious. They left behind enough history to be studied, and enough gaps to be exploited. In life, they guarded roads, castles, money, and Crusader ambitions. In memory, they came to guard something else entirely. The space where documented history ends and imagination begins. By the time they entered Egypt, they were no longer a small brotherhood watching over pilgrims on lonely roads. They were one of the armed minds of the crusading world. And Egypt was about to test whether that mind truly understood the land it hoped to conquer. The first great Crusader gamble in Egypt began with a city at the edge of water. Damietta stood near the mouth of the Nile, close to the place where river, sea, marsh, and trade met in a complicated embrace. To an army arriving from the Mediterranean, it looked like a key. Not the whole kingdom, not Cairo, not the full machinery of Egyptian power, but a key all the same. And medieval armies loved keys. They loved the idea that one fortress, one harbor, one gate, one decisive blow might unlock a problem that was otherwise too large to solve. Damietta seemed to offer exactly that kind of promise. Capture it, and the Crusaders would have a foothold inside Egypt. Hold it, and they might threaten the Nile Delta. Use it well, and perhaps Egypt could be forced to bargain. In the minds of many Crusader leaders, the city was not merely a target. It was the beginning of a chain reaction. This was the logic behind the Fifth Crusade. The plan had a certain hard practicality to it. Earlier crusading efforts had shown that simply marching toward Jerusalem did not guarantee lasting success. Even if the holy city could be recovered, holding it remained another matter. Egypt, by contrast, was seen as the power behind the struggle, the reservoir of wealth and strength that helped sustain Muslim resistance in the region. Strike there, and perhaps the Crusaders could do more than win a city. They could change the balance of the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The Templars entered Egypt inside that larger expectation. They were not the only force present, and they did not control the crusade by themselves. The campaign brought together different Crusader contingents: church leadership, nobles, sailors, and military orders, each carrying its own assumptions and ambitions. That mix was always dangerous. A crusading army could pray under one banner and still argue under a dozen private loyalties. Unity was preached more easily than practiced. But the Templars mattered because they represented experience. They were not new to frontier war. They understood siege, cavalry, discipline, and the costly rhythm of campaigns in the East. Their presence gave weight to the enterprise. When men saw the white mantles with the red cross among the Crusader host, they were not looking at temporary enthusiasm. They were looking at one of the permanent institutions of holy war. And yet, even permanent institutions can be drawn into temporary illusions. The campaign against Damietta rested on a seductive belief that Egypt could be made vulnerable through one carefully chosen point. In fairness, this was not foolish on the surface. Ports matter. River mouths matter. Commercial centers matter. A city like Damietta could supply ships, block access, anchor negotiations, and serve as a symbol of momentum. Medieval war often did turn on the capture or loss of fortified places. The danger was not that Damietta was unimportant. The danger was that its importance could be exaggerated. A city can be a door, but a door is not the same as the house. Egypt was not waiting passively behind Damietta, ready to collapse if the Crusaders pushed hard enough. It had depth, administration, and rulers capable of delay, negotiation, and counter-strategy. It had the Nile, which did not behave like the roads and hills many Crusaders understood better. It had distance. It had climate. It had the power to stretch an invading army until faith became fatigue. Still, in the beginning, hope was easier to carry than doubt. Imagine the first sight of the Egyptian coast through Crusader eyes. Not the Egypt of later travel posters, not the Egypt of museum glass and golden masks, but a living Islamic country of towns, towers, boats, fields, mosques, markets, and military watchfulness. The men arriving there were not stepping into an empty biblical stage. They were entering someone else's home, someone else's system, someone else's guarded wealth. For the Templars, this mattered. Their order was built on the idea of sacred geography, places made urgent by faith. But Egypt complicated that idea. It was sacred in memory, yes, but it was also practical in every direction. Waterways had to be crossed. Camps had to be supplied. Horses had to be kept alive. Fortifications had to be studied not as symbols, but as obstacles. The city before them was not a metaphor. It was a problem of walls, towers, ships, disease, food, morale, and time. Damietta would test all of that. The siege did not unfold as a clean, heroic action. Sieges almost never do. They are machines that grind both sides. Men arrive imagining banners and decisive assaults. Then the days lengthen. Supplies rot. Weather shifts. Wounds sour. Commanders quarrel. Rumors become their own kind of weather. The enemy inside the walls does not need to defeat the besiegers in open battle if delay can do some of the work. A siege asks a cruel question. Who can endure longer? That question suited the Templars in one sense. They were trained for endurance. Their identity prized obedience, resilience, and the suppression of private fear. But Egypt added layers that discipline alone could not remove. The campaign depended on coordination among groups that did not always trust one another. It depended on naval support. It depended on understanding a river landscape whose timing could punish ignorance. It depended on the assumption that success at Damietta would lead somewhere useful afterward. That last point is the quiet center of the gamble. Crusader history is full of moments where the taking of a place created a new problem rather than solving the old one. A captured city must be defended. A victory must be interpreted. Leaders must decide whether to negotiate, advance, consolidate, or wait. Victory can intoxicate an army into believing that the next step will be just as easy, especially when the first success has cost so much that no one wants to admit its limits. Damietta became a place where the Crusaders could imagine they had forced history open. But Egypt did not open so easily. The Templars would have understood at least part of the danger. They knew that war in the East was not won by appetite alone. Yet they were also part of an army whose spiritual imagination demanded meaning from hardship. If the siege was long, perhaps that meant the prize was great. If the suffering was severe, perhaps that meant the test was holy. In such a mood, caution could sound like weakness, and compromise could feel like betrayal. That mood would matter later. For now, the Crusaders stood before Damietta with the confidence of men who believed they had chosen the correct door. Behind that door, they thought, lay Jerusalem's future. Perhaps ransom, perhaps conquest, perhaps a bargaining power so overwhelming that the political map of the Levant would bend around it. And among them were the Templars, the order that guarded more than roads, now helping guard a hope much larger than any single city. They had come to Egypt chasing strategy, not legend. But the first Egyptian gamble already contained the ingredients from which legend would later grow. Secrecy, ambition, ancient land, holy war, and the unsettling possibility that something enormous might be hidden just beyond the next wall. Chapter 5. Damietta, the city of hunger and omens. Damietta did not fall in a single moment. It had to be worn down. That is the first thing to understand about the city and about the men waiting outside it. In later memory, medieval warfare is often flattened into charges, banners, and the clean drama of victory or defeat. But a siege was not clean. A siege was a long argument between hunger and patience. It was engineering, prayer, boredom, terror, bargaining, disease, and the slow exhaustion of human bodies under pressure. For the Crusaders before Damietta, Egypt revealed itself not as a mystery wrapped in gold, but as a landscape of practical difficulties. The Nile Delta was not a passive backdrop. It was alive with water, mud, cultivated land, channels, boats, and routes that could confuse an army trained to think in roads and walls. The Crusaders had come to seize a city, but they soon had to confront a whole environment. Canals could protect as effectively as trenches. River movement could supply defenders or frustrate attackers. The ground itself seemed to refuse simple conquest. This is where the image of the Templars in Egypt becomes more interesting than the legends. We do not need to imagine them slipping into hidden temples by torchlight to make the story compelling. What they actually saw was strange enough. They saw an Islamic military world that was organized, watchful, and not easily frightened by Crusader vows. They saw fortifications designed for the realities of the Delta. They saw wealth not merely in coins or palaces, but in fields, river traffic, storage, labor, and state capacity. They saw a country whose strength came from connection. That kind of wealth is less romantic than treasure, but far more important. A chest of gold can be stolen. A functioning system is harder to take. Damietta stood as part of that system. Its defenses mattered not because the city was magical, but because it controlled access. Around it, the Crusader camp became a temporary world of its own. Men from different lands tried to live together under war conditions. Horses needed fodder. Ships needed coordination. Priests tried to give suffering a sacred shape. Commanders weighed risk against reputation. Ordinary soldiers waited, sickened, recovered, weakened, complained, prayed, and sometimes died without ever seeing the dramatic battle they had imagined. Sieges created their own weather inside the mind. At first, confidence could hold. The army had crossed the sea. The cause was holy. The target was chosen. The Templars were present, along with other hardened fighters of the crusading world. Surely endurance would be rewarded. Then time began to do what time does. Food became more precious. Disease found the camp. Bad smells thickened. Rumors moved faster than reliable news. A sound from the city walls could become an omen. A delay could feel like divine testing. A small success could be inflated into proof that heaven favored the effort. A setback could be blamed on sin, cowardice, treachery, poor leadership, or simply the mysterious will of God. This was not irrational in the medieval world. It was how many people understood history. War was not only a contest of material forces. It was a moral and spiritual drama. The Crusaders were not simply asking whether their ladders were tall enough or their ships properly placed. They were also asking whether God wanted Egypt to fall. That question could become dangerous. Because once a campaign is framed as sacred necessity, practical compromise becomes harder to accept. Every hardship can be interpreted as a test that must be endured rather than a warning that should be heeded. The longer the army suffered before Damietta, the more the city seemed to matter. Pain itself became an argument. Men who had watched friends die in the camp could not easily turn around and say the objective was not worth the cost. The Templars would have known this pressure well. Their rule and identity trained them to endure. But endurance is not the same as wisdom. A disciplined order can stand firm inside a bad strategy. In fact, discipline may make that possible. The Templars were built to resist panic, to obey, to hold formation, to sacrifice personal safety for the mission. Those qualities made them formidable. They also meant that when the wider crusading leadership committed itself to an exhausting objective, the order could help sustain the effort beyond the point where a less committed force might have broken. This is one of the uncomfortable truths of crusading history. Virtue and disaster were not always opposites. Courage could prolong suffering. Faith could sharpen resolve while narrowing vision. Obedience could preserve order while binding men to decisions they might privately doubt. Damietta became a city of hunger and omens because it gathered all of those tensions in one place. Inside the city, defenders faced their own misery. Outside it, the Crusaders endured theirs. The siege was not a morality play with only one side suffering nobly. It was a human catastrophe shaped by strategy, belief, and ambition. The people of the city were not symbols placed there for Crusader destiny. They were inhabitants of a real place caught in the machinery of invasion. That fact is easy to lose when the story is told only from the perspective of knights and kings. And yet, from the Crusader camp, everything would have appeared charged with meaning. The ancient land around them carried biblical memory. The Nile itself seemed to belong to stories older than the crusading movement by centuries upon centuries. But the Egypt before them was not ancient in the way Europe imagined it. It was immediate. It resisted. It negotiated. It defended. It sickened them. It fed its own armies. It turned familiar Crusader confidence into uncertainty. This may be the closest we come to the real beginning of the Templar Egypt myth. Not a hidden chamber, a confrontation. The Templars encountered a world that was older than their order, richer than many of their European patrons, and more difficult to master than Crusader theory had allowed. What they saw at Damietta was not proof of secret Egyptian wisdom in the occult sense. It was proof of a different kind of knowledge, the knowledge embedded in place. How to use water, how to delay, how to survive siege, how to turn the invader's distance from home into a weapon. Eventually, Damietta would fall to the Crusaders, but even that victory carried a warning. A starving city can be taken without an empire being conquered. A gate can open while the larger country remains intact. A banner can rise over walls while the river, the fields, the roads, and the political future remain beyond control. This is the trap of siege warfare. Success feels absolute because it is visible. The deeper failure remains invisible until the army tries to move on. For the men who entered Damietta, the city must have seemed like confirmation. They had endured, they had suffered, they had won. But Egypt had not been solved. It had only allowed them to step farther in. And for the Templars, that step would matter. They had seen the wealth of Egypt, but also its resistance. They had seen the possibility of conquest, but also the cost of misunderstanding the land beneath their feet. The city of hunger and omens had given them a victory that looked like a doorway. What waited beyond it was not treasure. It was a deeper test of judgment. Chapter 6. The offer that could have changed history. There are moments in crusading history that feel less like battles than tests of imagination. The reported offers from Sultan al-Kamil during the Fifth Crusade belong to that category. According to accounts of the campaign, while the Crusaders held their position in Egypt, the Sultan made proposals that could have returned Jerusalem to Christian control in exchange for a Crusader withdrawal from Egyptian territory. For an army that had taken the cross, this should have sounded like the answer to years of prayer. Jerusalem, restored without having to fight through every road, fortress, and field between Egypt and the Holy City. The symbolic heart of the crusading movement placed within reach, not by final conquest, but by negotiation. And yet the offer was rejected. To modern ears, that can seem almost impossible to understand. Was Jerusalem not the point? Had sermons not called men eastward for the sake of the Holy Sepulchre? Had families not given sons, money, land, ships, and years of their lives to recover the city? If Egypt was only the road to Jerusalem, then why refuse the destination when it appeared? The answer is that, by this stage, the crusade had become trapped inside its own expanded logic. Egypt was no longer merely a bargaining target. It had become the prize itself. For some Crusader leaders, especially those who believed the campaign was unfolding under divine direction, accepting a negotiated return of Jerusalem may have seemed dangerously insufficient. A treaty could restore a city, but it would not destroy the power capable of threatening it again. A diplomatic settlement might look like success, but also like compromise. And compromise, in a crusading army, could easily be made to smell of weakness. This is where strategy and theology collided. From a practical perspective, Al-Kamil's offer deserves serious attention. If Jerusalem could be recovered through diplomacy, then the Crusaders might claim the spiritual triumph they wanted, while avoiding a deeper entanglement in Egypt. They could withdraw from a difficult theater before the land itself began to work more fiercely against them. They could preserve strength, lives, and political capital. But practical thinking was not the only voice in the camp. The crusading army was not a single mind. It was a gathering of factions, vows, egos, and authorities. Kings and nobles had reputations to protect. Churchmen had spiritual interpretations to defend. Military orders had institutional responsibilities. Ordinary soldiers had endured hunger, fear, and disease, and many would not have found it easy to accept that all their suffering should end in a bargain rather than a conquest. Pain makes people stubborn. A campaign that has cost little can change direction without much shame. A campaign that has cost lives begins to demand justification. The more the Crusaders suffered before Damietta, the more difficult it became to admit that a negotiated settlement might be wiser than pressing forward. To accept the offer would have required leaders to say, in effect, that Jerusalem gained through diplomacy was enough, and that Egypt, despite all the blood and prayer already invested, did not need to be taken. That was a hard sentence to speak. For the Templars, the situation would have been especially complex. Their order existed to defend the Holy Land, and Jerusalem's recovery mattered profoundly. Yet they were also part of the military reality on the ground. They knew that possession of a sacred city without durable strategic support could be fragile. Their world had already seen victories that did not last. They understood that a city could be given back and lost again if the surrounding balance of power remained unchanged. So the question was not as simple as faith versus foolishness. A cautious leader might reject the offer because it failed to solve the underlying strategic problem. A zealous leader might reject it because negotiation felt unworthy of the cause. An ambitious leader might reject it because Egypt seemed too valuable to abandon. Different motives could lead to the same decision, which is one reason the moment remains so revealing. It exposes the unstable heart of the crusading project. Was the goal to recover holy places, to defeat Muslim power, to secure trade routes and territory, to fulfill vows, to obey papal direction, to win glory, to protect the Latin East? The official language could make these aims sound unified, but in practice they pulled against one another. Jerusalem could be both the supreme objective and, suddenly, not enough. That contradiction should not be smoothed over. It is one of the most important details in the whole Egyptian story. The Crusaders had taught themselves to see Egypt as the key to Jerusalem. But once they had the key in their hands, they began to want the whole house. Their strategy had expanded faster than their capacity. What began as a plan to create leverage became a refusal to use leverage when it appeared. There is also a human element here that should not be ignored. Al-Kamil was not offering from a position of pure generosity. Medieval diplomacy was rarely sentimental. His proposals were political instruments, shaped by the pressures he faced and the calculations of survival. Offering Jerusalem could divide the Crusaders, buy time, protect Egypt, or reshape the war on terms more favorable to his own rule. To treat the offer as a simple gift would be naive, but to dismiss it entirely would be just as naive. The offer mattered because it revealed that Egypt was not only a battlefield, it was a negotiating table. It was a place where the future of Jerusalem could be discussed without the city itself being under siege. That alone shows how central Egypt had become. The fate of the Holy Land was being argued in the Delta among armies whose boots were sinking into Egyptian mud. And in that mud, certainty became dangerous. The Crusaders believed that pressing on might bring a greater victory. Perhaps Cairo could be threatened. Perhaps Egypt could be broken. Perhaps the entire political order of the region could be forced open. Those hopes were not completely irrational, but they were inflated. They depended on the assumption that momentum could overcome environment, that sacred purpose could overcome logistical strain, and that the enemy's willingness to negotiate proved weakness rather than strategic patience. Here, Egypt played its quiet trick. It allowed the Crusaders to confuse opportunity with destiny. Damietta had fallen. The Sultan had negotiated. Jerusalem had been discussed. Everything seemed to suggest that the campaign stood at the edge of something immense. But the signs could be read another way. The offer may have been less a doorway into triumph than a warning. Take what can be gained before the river and the country close around you. The warning was not heeded. In later centuries, people would wonder whether the Templars found hidden secrets in Egypt. The more grounded mystery may be this: what did they understand in that moment, and what were they unable to make the wider army understand? Did they see the danger of refusing a settlement? Did they share the hard-line view that Egypt itself had to be conquered? Did different men within the order think differently, as men inside institutions often do? The evidence does not let us enter their private councils with certainty. What we can say is that the crusading army chose not to end the campaign with a negotiated Jerusalem. It chose Egypt, or perhaps more accurately, it chose the idea of Egypt. Egypt as prize, Egypt as solution, Egypt as the great enemy structure that had to be mastered before the Holy Land could ever be safe. That choice changed the meaning of the crusade. From that point, the campaign was no longer merely about recovering what had been lost. It was about proving that Crusader power could bend an entire land to its will, and the Nile was about to answer. Chapter 7. The Nile turns against them. The Crusaders had taken Damietta, refused the great bargain, and chosen to move deeper. That decision changed everything. A siege, for all its misery, gives an army a fixed purpose. There is a wall. There is a city. There is a line between those inside and those outside. But a march into Egypt was different. It required the Crusaders to stop thinking like besiegers and begin thinking like invaders in a living landscape. And that landscape was not neutral. The Nile was not scenery. It was road, barrier, weapon, calendar, and judge. To an Egyptian commander, the river was part of the battlefield. To an army that did not fully understand its rhythms, the river could become a trap that appeared only after it had already closed. In 1221, when the Crusader army advanced toward Cairo, confidence had not disappeared. If anything, it had become more dangerous because it had survived hardship. The men had endured Damietta. They had taken the city. They had watched offers come and go. They had been told, directly or indirectly, that Egypt could still be forced open if they pressed hard enough. But pressing forward is not the same as controlling what lies ahead. The march toward Cairo exposed the weakness hidden beneath Crusader ambition. Supply lines stretched. Coordination became harder. The farther the army moved from Damietta, the more the captured city became not a triumph, but an anchor. What had once seemed like a doorway now had to be protected behind them, while the main force moved into country shaped by water, timing, and local knowledge. Egypt did not need to defeat them in one glorious battlefield scene. It needed to surround them with consequences. The flooding of the Nile played a central role in the collapse that followed. As waters rose and routes became more difficult, the Crusader army found itself increasingly vulnerable. Movement narrowed, supplies faltered, retreat became harder to organize. The very land seemed to shift from beneath the logic of the campaign. This is where medieval Crusader confidence met something older than any crusading vow: seasonal geography. The army had entered Egypt with a theory: capture Damietta, pressure the interior, force the enemy to yield, perhaps threaten Cairo itself. But theories are fragile when they depend on conditions they do not control. The Nile's flood did not argue. It did not debate theology. It simply changed what was possible. That is one reason this failure is so important. It was not just a defeat by soldiers. It was a defeat by system. Egyptian forces used the land intelligently, But the land itself also imposed limits. The Crusaders faced military opposition, yes, but also distance, water, disease, hunger, and the collapse of confidence when every direction seemed to grow narrower. For the Templars, this must have been a bitter education. They were not strangers to hardship. They had fought in difficult terrain before. Their order was built to endure where ordinary enthusiasm failed. Yet Egypt presented a form of resistance that could not be solved by discipline alone. A Templar could obey. A Templar could hold formation. A Templar could charge, defend, guard, and die. But no vow could lower the Nile. That fact should sit at the center of the story. The medieval crusading imagination often treated holy war as a contest between faith and opposition. But Egypt revealed a third force, place. Not place as background, but place as an active condition of history. Armies do not merely fight enemies. They fight weather, rivers, food, mud, insects, fatigue, and the distance between hope and bread. The failed march toward Cairo was a lesson in scale. Damietta had been difficult, but Cairo was something else entirely. To threaten the heart of Egypt, the Crusaders needed reliable supply, clear movement, unity among leaders, and a plan for what would happen if the enemy refused the kind of decisive confrontation Crusader morale preferred. Instead, they were drawn into a situation where their strengths became harder to use. Heavy cavalry, religious determination, and battlefield courage mattered less when movement was restricted, and survival became the central problem. The Egyptian strategy did not need to be romanticized to be respected. It worked because it understood the invader's vulnerability. An army far from home is always negotiating with its own stomach. It can win arguments in council and still lose to logistics. It can carry sacred banners and still find that wet ground, blocked routes, and shrinking supplies are stronger than speeches. This is the point where the Fifth Crusade's Egyptian dream began to collapse. The men who had refused Jerusalem in exchange for withdrawal now faced the possibility of losing everything they had gained. Their confidence had led them away from the one position they held securely and into a landscape where the enemy could decide the tempo. The advance became a crisis. The crisis became a retreat. The retreat became an admission that Egypt had not been conquered at all. It had been misread. And misreading Egypt was expensive. The Crusaders were eventually forced into negotiations from a position far weaker than the one they had held earlier. Damietta, the city of hunger and omens, had to be surrendered. The great Egyptian gamble ended not with Cairo falling, not with Jerusalem restored, not with the balance of the region transformed, but with the Crusader army escaping disaster by giving up the very prize that had justified so much suffering. There is a quiet cruelty in that outcome. They had taken Damietta and lost it. They had been offered Jerusalem and refused it. They had advanced toward Cairo and failed to reach their dream. The campaign did not merely end badly. It ended in a way that exposed the logic of the whole enterprise. The Crusaders wanted Egypt because they believed it would unlock Jerusalem. But when the chance came to use Egypt as leverage, they wanted more. And when they reached for more, Egypt took back the leverage. For later legends, this kind of failure was almost too plain to satisfy. People prefer hidden reasons. They like to imagine that disasters conceal secrets, a betrayed plan, a lost relic, a forbidden discovery, a buried treasure glimpsed and then stolen away. But the truth may be more severe. The Crusaders did not need a secret curse to fail in Egypt. They needed only overconfidence, divided leadership, poor timing, and a river that belonged to those who understood it better. That does not make the story smaller. It makes it sharper. Because the lesson the Templars carried from Egypt was not wrapped in gold or written in an unknown script. It was written in mud, hunger, and surrender. They had seen how a powerful army could become helpless when geography turned against it. They had seen how victory at a city could tempt leaders into a wider disaster. They had seen that Egypt was not simply a prize to be seized, but a world of systems that punished shallow understanding. The Nile turned against them, but not in the language of miracle. It turned against them in the language of timing. And perhaps that was more frightening. A miracle can be interpreted, prayed over, explained by sin or favor. Timing is colder. It suggests that the campaign failed not because heaven was mysterious, but because men ignored the ordinary conditions by which wars are actually won or lost. For the Templars, Egypt's first lesson was complete. The door had opened, then the river had closed it. Chapter 8. What the Templars learned from Egypt. The easiest story would be the treasure story. It is tempting, almost suspiciously tempting, to imagine the Templars leaving Egypt with something hidden under their mantles. A relic, a map, a text copied from some older archive, a fragment of knowledge too dangerous for ordinary men. Egypt invites that kind of thinking because Egypt has always been larger than the facts people carry away from it. Even those who arrive with armies can leave behind legends, but the more credible discovery was less glittering. The Templars learned that Egypt was not a lock to be picked. It was a structure to be understood. And in the Fifth Crusade, they had not understood it deeply enough. That lesson would have been practical, not mystical. It came from the failed march, the surrender of Damietta, the swollen Nile, the strained supply lines, the negotiations that had turned from confident refusal into necessity. It came from watching the Crusader army discover, too late, that holding a city did not mean holding the land around it. This kind of knowledge rarely survives in legend because it is not dramatic in the right way. No one builds a conspiracy around the discovery that logistics matter. No bard sings for very long about administrative depth. No later occult writer gets much profit from saying, with appropriate solemnity, that canals can ruin an invasion. Yet these were precisely the truths Egypt forced onto the crusading world. The first lesson was depth. The Crusader states were vulnerable because they were narrow. They clung to coastlines, fortresses, corridors, and negotiated spaces. Egypt had room behind its front line. It could absorb pressure. It could lose a city and continue to function. That was not invincibility, but it was resilience. For the Templars, who spent much of their existence defending exposed positions, this must have been impossible to ignore. The second lesson was administration. Armies are not sustained by courage alone. They are sustained by systems that collect grain, move goods, coordinate labor, raise taxes, maintain routes, and communicate danger. Egypt's strength lay not only in warriors, but in the machinery behind them. This may sound dull until we remember that dull machinery often decides dramatic events. A kingdom that can feed men and animals, repair defenses, and keep information moving can survive shocks that would shatter a more fragile state. The third lesson was water. To outsiders, the Nile could appear as a wonder. To Egyptian power, It was also infrastructure and defense. It shaped agriculture, movement, timing, and military possibility. The Crusaders could sail to Egypt, land before Damietta, and bring force to bear on a target. But to master the deeper country, they needed more than ships and zeal. They needed an intimacy with water routes and flood cycles that could not be improvised in a council tent. This is where local knowledge becomes a weapon. A commander who understands when the river rises, where paths vanish, which canals can be blocked, and how an army will behave when its supplies thin, possesses a kind of intelligence no captured relic can replace. The Crusaders had bravery. The Egyptians had home ground. In Egypt, home ground meant more than hills and roads. It meant the annual pulse of the country itself. The fourth lesson was political patience. The Sultan's reported offers during the Fifth Crusade were not merely acts of desperation. They were part of a broader game of survival, division, and timing. Egypt's rulers could negotiate, delay, pressure, and wait for Crusader unity to fray. The crusading army, by contrast, often struggled to remain one thing. It was an alliance of vows, ambitions, languages, ranks, and institutions. The longer the campaign lasted, the more those internal tensions mattered. For the Templars, who lived inside an order built on hierarchy and obedience, this must have been a striking contrast. Their own discipline did not extend to the whole army. They could keep their rule, their formation, their institutional memory, but they could not make every prince, legate, noble, and contingent think with a single mind. This is another reason the treasure legend misses the point. The Templars did not need to find hidden wisdom in Egypt. They encountered open wisdom everywhere. If we use the word in its older, harsher sense, knowledge tested by survival. Egypt knew how to remain Egypt under attack. It knew how to let an invader spend itself. It knew how to make a victory become a burden. Of course, we should be careful not to imagine the Templars as modern analysts taking notes for a military academy. They were medieval religious warriors. Their understanding would have been filtered through theology, honor, institutional habit, and the limited information available to them. Some may have interpreted failure as divine judgment. Others may have blamed leaders, timing, sin, weather, or the enemy's cunning. Human beings rarely learn one clean lesson from disaster. But institutions remember patterns even when individuals explain them differently. The Templars had seen Egypt once now. They had seen the Delta's complications, the cost of overextension, and the danger of mistaking a captured city for a conquered country. Those memories would not vanish simply because the campaign ended. Military orders lived across campaigns. They carried experience from one generation of crusading to the next, through veterans, reports, councils, and the quiet institutional habit of knowing what had gone wrong before. And yet, memory does not always prevent repetition. This is perhaps the most human part of the story. People can learn from disaster and still return to the conditions that produced it, not because they are stupid, but because the strategic problem remains. Egypt still mattered. Jerusalem still haunted the crusading imagination. The Latin East still needed leverage. European rulers still wanted a grand victory worthy of their vows and reputations. The old logic did not die simply because it had failed. It adjusted, waited, and came back. That is why the question of what the Templars learned in Egypt matters so much. Their knowledge did not lead them away from Egypt forever. It made Egypt more recognizable, perhaps more feared, but also more central. The land that had humiliated one crusade continued to appear as the place where the future might be changed, if only the next army were better led, better supplied, more disciplined, more favored by God. This is how history repeats without copying itself. The second attempt would not be identical to the first. The leaders would be different. The mood would be different. The immediate circumstances would change. But beneath the surface lay the same belief, that Egypt was the great hinge of the Eastern Mediterranean, and that controlling it might unlock what had remained painfully out of reach. For the Templars, Egypt had become a school of limits. It taught that geography could humble theology when theology ignored geography. It taught that wealth was not merely something stored, but something organized. It taught that Muslim power in the region could not be dismissed as a temporary obstacle to a sacred storyline. It taught that the enemy was not only brave or numerous, but intelligent, adaptive, and rooted in place. Those are not the lessons people usually want from a mystery. They want a chamber beneath a temple. They want a scroll hidden in a saddlebag. They want the moment when armed monks discover that history is secretly governed by symbols and codes. But the real knowledge carried away from Egypt was more severe and more useful. A land can defeat you without hiding anything. It only has to know itself better than you do. Chapter 9. The second descent into the Delta. A failed campaign does not always end an idea. Sometimes it sharpens it. Years after the Fifth Crusade collapsed in Egypt, the old logic returned with a new face, a new king, and a new burden of expectation. The target was still Egypt. The promise was still Jerusalem. The hope was still that one decisive blow against the Nile kingdom could change the fate of the Holy Land. This time, the crusade came under Louis IX of France. Louis was not merely another noble with a taste for glory. He was a king whose piety shaped his public identity, a ruler who understood crusading not as decoration for power, but as a sacred duty bound to kingship itself. That made his expedition serious. It had money, preparation, royal authority, and the moral force of a monarch who believed deeply in the cause he had taken up. And still, belief did not erase geography. Egypt drew the Crusaders back because the strategic problem had never gone away. Jerusalem remained vulnerable. The Crusader states remained exposed. Muslim power in the Eastern Mediterranean remained connected to Egyptian wealth and military capacity. The lesson of the Fifth Crusade had not been that Egypt was irrelevant. Quite the opposite. The disaster had confirmed Egypt's importance. It had shown that the land was difficult to conquer, precisely because it mattered so much. This is one of history's cruel patterns. Failure can warn people away from a plan, but it can also convince them that the plan was correct and only the execution was flawed. Perhaps the earlier leaders had moved at the wrong time. Perhaps they had argued too much. Perhaps they had failed to press their advantage properly, or trusted the wrong counsel, or lost discipline at the critical moment. Perhaps with a stronger king and better preparation, Egypt could finally be broken. That word, perhaps, has carried armies into many graves. The Templars returned within this renewed crusading vision. By the time of Louis IX's expedition, they were no strangers to the Egyptian theater. The order had institutional memory, and that memory included Damietta, negotiation, flooding, retreat, and surrender. They knew, or at least should have known, that Egypt was not a simple prize. But they also lived inside the continuing reality of Crusader politics. Their role was not to retire from the great struggle because one campaign had failed. Their existence was tied to the defense and recovery of sacred territory. If a major crusade aimed at Egypt, the Templars would be drawn into it. The second descent into the Delta began, significantly, with an echo. Damietta again became the opening target. There is something almost haunting about that repetition. The same city, or at least the same strategic doorway, reappeared at the beginning of the plan. To the Crusaders, this made sense. Damietta was still valuable. It still offered access, anchorage, and a foothold. It still seemed like the place where Egypt could be entered and pressured. But echoes are dangerous in history. They can make people believe they are correcting the past when they are merely walking back into its shape. This time, Damietta fell quickly. That rapid success must have felt like vindication. The earlier siege had been long and punishing. Now the city was in Crusader hands with startling ease. For Louis and his army, this could be read as a sign that the campaign had begun under favor. For the Templars and other veterans of Eastern warfare, it may also have carried a more complicated meaning. A city taken quickly still had to be held. A foothold still had to be turned into strategy. The old question returned immediately. What now? That question is where victories often begin to decay. A captured city creates choices. Advance, wait, negotiate, fortify, raid, consolidate, or withdraw. Each option carries risk. Waiting can preserve strength, but it can also invite disease and disagreement. Advancing can maintain momentum, but it can stretch supply lines. Negotiation can secure gains, but it can appear dishonorable to those who crave a more complete triumph. In Egypt, delay and movement were both dangerous. The Crusaders had to think about the Nile, the season, food, horses, boats, enemy forces, and the political situation beyond their sight. They had to act before confidence turned stale, but not so recklessly that confidence became blindness. This balance is hard for any army. It is especially hard for a crusading army, because spiritual urgency does not naturally enjoy waiting for logistics to become convenient. For Louis IX, Egypt was not merely a battlefield. It was a test of holy kingship. His expedition had to mean something. It had to justify the money, suffering, and prestige invested in it. To capture Damietta and then achieve nothing greater would feel incomplete. A king who had crossed the sea for the cross could not easily settle for holding a port, while the larger dream remained upriver. So the old temptation returned. Move toward the heart. The road into Egypt was again imagined as a path toward decision. Somewhere beyond Damietta lay the possibility of forcing surrender, breaking resistance, and transforming the Crusader position. The Nile Delta, however, was still the Nile Delta. Its waterways did not become simpler because a king of France had arrived. Its military realities did not soften because the first objective had fallen. And the defenders of Egypt had learned as well. This point matters. Crusaders were not the only ones with memory. Egyptian commanders and rulers also understood the pattern of invasion. They knew what Damietta meant. They knew that a Crusader army, once inside the Delta, could be watched, delayed, drawn forward, and attacked under conditions less favorable to its strengths. They knew the landscape was not only defensive, but instructive. It taught invaders the wrong lesson first. That entry was possible. Only later did it show them the price of staying. For the Templars, the second campaign must have felt both familiar and unstable. They had returned to a land already marked by failure, but under circumstances that seemed to promise correction. Their discipline and courage were once again required. Their experience mattered. Yet experience does not automatically become wisdom at the scale of an entire army. A military order can remember danger and still be overruled by momentum, royal command, or the emotional gravity of a campaign that has already gone too far to feel reversible. That is the quiet tragedy gathering here. The Templars were not naive children walking into Egypt with no sense of risk. The Crusaders were not fools simply because they tried again. Egypt genuinely mattered. A successful conquest might have altered the balance of power in the region. The plan had logic, but logic becomes perilous when it underestimates the thing it seeks to master. By returning to Egypt, the Crusaders revealed that the true treasure they imagined was not gold beneath the sand. It was control. Control of the Nile's wealth. Control of the roots behind Jerusalem. Control of the political future of the Holy Land. Control over the fear that Christian victories in the East could never last while Egypt remained strong. But control is a hard thing to seize from a land built around rhythms older than the invaders' plans. The second descent into the Delta began with confidence, royal devotion, and a city falling faster than expected. It began with the appearance of success. And perhaps that was the most dangerous beginning of all. Because Egypt had already shown that it did not need to stop Crusaders at the door. It could let them enter. Chapter 10. Mansurah and the Trap of Glory. Mansurah was not simply a battle. It was a warning disguised as an opportunity. After Damietta fell, the Crusader army moved deeper into Egypt under Louis IX, pressing toward the next great decision. The old dream had returned. If the army could advance beyond the Delta's outer gate, if it could force the enemy to break, if it could make Egypt yield, then Jerusalem and the future of the Holy Land might bend with it. But dreams become dangerous when they begin to sound like instructions. The approach to Mansurah brought the Crusaders into a landscape where confidence had to travel through narrow choices. Waterways shaped movement. The army could not simply spread itself across open ground and impose its will. Every crossing mattered. Every delay mattered. Every rumor of weakness on the Egyptian side carried temptation. A medieval army moving under sacred pressure did not always need a trap to be perfectly hidden. Sometimes it only needed a door left half open. At Mansurah, that door appeared. The Crusaders found a way across a branch of the Nile system, and part of the army pushed forward with sudden violence. The moment had all the ingredients that turn caution into impatience. A difficult crossing, a chance to surprise the enemy, the smell of victory nearby, and aristocratic warriors eager not to be remembered as hesitant when glory seemed to be waiting in the streets. Among those who advanced were Templars. This is where the story becomes painful, because the Templars were not cowards undone by fear. They were men trained to move toward danger. Their reputation rested on discipline and ferocity. In the logic of their order, hesitation could be more shameful than death. And in the chaos of a fast-moving attack, the line between disciplined courage and fatal overreach can become almost impossible to see. That line was crossed at Mansurah. The Crusader force surged into the city, but Mansurah was not an empty prize waiting to be claimed. It was an urban battlefield, and cities are cruel to cavalry. Streets compress movement, corners hide enemies, noise breaks command. A rider who is terrifying in open ground can become vulnerable when hemmed in by walls, alleys, and confusion. The very qualities that made mounted knights powerful, speed, shock, weight, forward momentum, could become liabilities when the fight dissolved into fragments. The advance that had seemed bold became exposed. Egyptian forces responded with speed and intelligence. The Crusaders who entered Mansurah found themselves caught in a fight they could not easily control. The battle became a tangle of close violence, broken coordination, and decisions made too quickly to be corrected. Men who had crossed into the city expecting momentum instead found isolation. The streets did not reward bravery in the same way open fields did. They punished disorder. The Templars suffered heavily. That sentence is plain, but it carries more than numbers. A military order like the Temple did not lose men as a kingdom lost anonymous infantry. It lost trained brothers, institutional memory, disciplined fighters who were expensive to equip and difficult to replace. It lost reputation in the strange way reputation is damaged not only by cowardice, but by the spectacle of courage becoming useless. To die bravely in a doomed advance might inspire admiration, but it also leaves behind a question no order enjoys. Who allowed bravery to be spent this way? Mansurah became a trap of glory because it offered the emotional shape of victory before the conditions for victory existed. That is one of the oldest dangers in war. A commander sees the enemy waver. A noble sees a chance to be first through the breach. A religious warrior sees hesitation as a failure of faith. The army sees a moment and mistakes it for destiny. Once the forward rush begins, nobody wants to be the man who says, "Stop." And so movement becomes its own argument. It is easy, from a safe distance, to condemn the decision. But the more useful question is why such decisions keep happening. Part of the answer lies in the culture of elite warfare. Medieval nobles were raised inside an honor system that rewarded visible courage. Reputation had political value. To be seen leading, charging, striking first, risking death. These were not decorative gestures. They formed the language of power. A leader who appeared cautious at the wrong time could lose authority. A warrior who held back while others advanced might survive the battle and lose something less tangible but deeply real. The Templars, too, lived inside a version of that pressure, sharpened by religion. Their courage was not supposed to be personal vanity. It was supposed to be obedience to a higher mission. But ideals do not remove human momentum. In battle, especially a battle unfolding quickly, sacred purpose and martial pride can ride very close together. Mansurah exposed that closeness. It showed how courage, pride, and confusion can become indistinguishable when events move faster than judgment. One man's heroic advance is another man's reckless disobedience. One group's zeal is another group's collapse of command. The same action can be remembered as devotion by some and disaster by others. The evidence does not allow us to hear every argument shouted in those moments. We cannot cleanly separate every motive. We should resist the false comfort of pretending we know exactly what each Templar thought as the attack unfolded. What we can say is that the battle revealed the old Egyptian lesson in a new form. Egypt did not have to defeat Crusader courage by being stronger in the abstract. It could defeat that courage by drawing it into conditions where courage lost its shape. That is what makes Mansurah so important to the wider mystery. Later legends often imagine the Templars as keepers of hidden knowledge, almost supernaturally controlled and calculating. Mansurah gives us something more human. The order could be brave, disciplined, experienced, and still be pulled into confusion. Its white mantles did not make it immune to poor timing. Its vows did not protect it from urban ambush. Its reputation did not turn the streets of Mansurah into open ground. For Louis IX's crusade, the battle damaged more than the army's numbers. It damaged the campaign's inner confidence. Damietta had fallen so easily that success seemed to have returned to the crusading story. Mansurah interrupted that story with a different message. Entry was not conquest. Momentum was not mastery. And a city could devour the very men who believed they had just found the road to triumph. The psychological effect must have been severe. Armies are sustained by more than food. They are sustained by belief in the plan. When elite fighters fall in a confused and costly action, the plan itself begins to look less ordained and more fragile. Men start to wonder whether the leaders understand the country. They wonder whether the enemy is weaker than expected or stronger in ways they failed to notice. They wonder whether the first victory at Damietta was a sign of favor or bait laid by circumstance. And once an army begins asking those questions, fear becomes harder to contain. Mansurah did not end the crusade in one clean stroke. History rarely offers that kind of theatrical neatness, but it shifted the campaign's weight. The Crusaders had come seeking the decisive moment that would open Egypt. Instead, they found a city that turned decision into confusion. They had come to impose glory on the landscape. Instead, the landscape and its defenders imposed reality on them. For the Templars, Mansurah was a wound in the order's Egyptian memory. Not because it proved they were weak. It proved something more unsettling. That strength can be misused without anyone intending dishonor. The men who died there may have died with courage, but courage by itself did not make the advance wise. Egypt had once used the Nile to close around Crusader ambition. Now it used streets, speed, and confusion. The form had changed. The lesson had not. Chapter 11. Blood in the streets. Silence in the Chronicles. After Mansurah, the crusade did not collapse all at once. It frayed. That distinction matters, because disasters in history are often remembered as single blows. One charge, one ambush, one fatal decision. But armies usually break more slowly than stories suggest. They continue moving after the damage has already been done. They obey commands, bury the dead when they can, tighten formations, argue over blame, and tell themselves that the campaign can still be saved. The Crusaders after Mansurah were not immediately a vanished force. They still had a king. They still had soldiers. They still held Damietta behind them. They still possessed faith, weapons, and the memory of earlier success. But something essential had been injured. Momentum. In war, momentum is not only speed. It is the feeling that events are still leaning in your direction. Before Mansurah, Louis IX's army could believe that Damietta had opened the road into Egypt. After Mansurah, that belief had to survive the sight of elite men cut down in streets where courage had not produced control. The army had entered the city's violence and discovered that bravery could become trapped in corners. For the Templars, the cost was especially sharp. A military order lives by continuity. Its brothers are not simply individual fighters gathered for one campaign season. They are trained within a rule, absorbed into a hierarchy, and shaped by habits that take time to build. When Templars fell at Mansurah, the loss was not only measured in bodies, it was measured in experience, discipline, memory, and the fragile confidence that the order could read danger better than less seasoned warriors. That confidence could not be publicly mourned in the way a private family mourns. The Templars did not exist to display grief. Their identity demanded endurance. A brother died. The order continued. A commander fell. Another obeyed. A disaster struck. The mantle was not supposed to become a garment of complaint. This is one reason the emotional life of the Templars can feel so distant to us. Their records, where they survive, do not open easily into personal sorrow. Medieval chronicles often tell us who advanced, who died, who commanded, who failed, and who was blamed. They do not always tell us what it felt like to watch an order's confidence bleed away in a foreign city. So we are left with a kind of silence. Not silence because nothing happened, but silence because the kind of thing that happened is difficult to preserve. Panic in a street. A horse slipping or stopping where it should have charged. A shouted order lost in the noise. A brother recognized too late among the dead. The sudden understanding that the enemy knows the city better than you know your own plan. Chronicles can record losses, but they struggle to record disorientation. And disorientation was now becoming one of Egypt's most effective weapons. After Mansurah, the Crusader command structure faced the terrible problem of recovering clarity. Urban ambush had already broken the clean lines of expectation. Disease and exhaustion pressed harder. Supplies became more uncertain. The army still had to make decisions, but decisions made after a shock are rarely made inside a calm mind. Leaders may become too cautious or not cautious enough. They may insist the original plan still works because admitting otherwise would be unbearable. They may blame subordinates, rivals, the weather, the timing, or sin. Sometimes they blame everyone except the assumptions that led them there. This is where the strategic cost to the Templars becomes larger than the battle itself. The order had entered the Egyptian campaign as part of the serious machinery of Crusader war. Its presence signaled competence, discipline, and sacred commitment. Mansurah did not erase that reputation, but it complicated it. If the Templars could suffer so severely in Egypt, then Egypt was not simply another theater where their usual strengths could be applied. It was a place where even their strengths could be turned against them. Their willingness to advance made them vulnerable to traps of movement. Their discipline kept them committed inside a campaign whose larger direction was deteriorating. Their identity as holy warriors made retreat psychologically harder, even when retreat might be the more intelligent word for survival. This is not a criticism of their courage. It is a recognition of its limits. The crusade now moved in the shadow of a contradiction. Louis IX remained personally devout and determined. The army still had a cause powerful enough to sustain hardship. Yet the practical situation was worsening. Men weakened. Sickness spread. The Egyptian resistance grew more confident. What had begun as a royal expedition with carefully prepared ambitions was becoming a contest over endurance. And Egypt had already shown in the earlier crusade that it knew how to win that kind of contest. The streets of Mansurah had not merely killed men. They had taught the survivors to doubt the shape of their own story. That kind of doubt is corrosive. A crusading army depends on interpretation. It needs suffering to mean purification, delay to mean testing, victory to mean favor, and death to mean sacrifice rather than waste. After Mansurah, those meanings became harder to hold in place. When too many good men die in confusion, the mind begins to ask whether the campaign is being refined by hardship or simply consumed by it. The difference is enormous. A test has a purpose. Consumption only has an appetite. Egypt began to look less like a prize and more like an appetite. It absorbed ships, horses, vows, noble reputations, careful preparations, and the blood of military orders. It did not need to reveal hidden chambers or ancient curses. Its danger was visible in the ordinary ruin of an army that could not turn early success into final victory. The longer the Crusaders remained, the more the land seemed to take from them without giving back certainty. And still, later myth would prefer the hidden version. It would rather imagine the Templars glimpsing secrets than imagine them exhausted, wounded, and caught inside the same confusion as other men. It would rather turn Egypt into an occult stage than admit that history's most humbling revelations are often logistical, political, and human. The silence in the Chronicles made room for invention. But before it became legend, it was simply silence. The silence around fear, failure, and grief too ordinary to be written beautifully. That silence matters, because it reminds us that the Templars were not symbols moving through a puzzle designed for future conspiracy. They were men inside an institution, and institutions feel pain strangely. They absorb it, rename it, discipline it, and carry it forward. The order could not stop being the order because Mansurah had gone badly. It had to continue. It had to keep its authority, its rule, its role beside kings and commanders. It had to turn loss into memory without letting memory become paralysis. But Egypt was becoming a memory that would not settle. For the Crusader army, the campaign's momentum was collapsing into sickness, exhaustion, and uncertainty. For the Templars, the emotional wound was joined to a strategic one. They had returned to Egypt after the lessons of Damietta and the Nile, and now another lesson had been added in blood. In this country, even a moment that looked like glory could open into ruin. The Chronicles give us names, movements, outcomes. They do not give us the full interior darkness of the men who survived. So we stand at a distance, careful not to pretend we hear what was never recorded. Yet we can still see the shape of the cost. Mansurah left the crusade with less strength, less confidence, and less room for illusion. It left the Templars with dead brothers and a harsher understanding of what Egypt could do to disciplined men. The army had not yet reached its final humiliation, but the streets had already spoken. Chapter 12. Captivity, Ransom, and the Price of Failure. Failure has a sound after battle. It is not always the clash of weapons. Sometimes it is coughing in the camp. Sometimes it is the creak of wagons carrying men who cannot walk. Sometimes it is the low, embarrassed voice of a commander trying to explain why yesterday's plan cannot survive today's conditions. After Mansurah, Louis IX's crusade entered that harsher phase, where defeat was no longer a possibility to be avoided, but a reality spreading through the army. The Crusaders were exhausted. Disease weakened them. Supplies faltered. The Egyptian forces, having survived the first shock of invasion and punished the advance at Mansurah, pressed the advantage. The royal expedition, that had begun with solemn confidence, now found itself struggling not for conquest, but for escape from the consequences of its own ambition. This is one of the least romantic turns in the story. The Crusaders had come to Egypt imagining leverage. They had taken Damietta. They had marched toward the interior. They had tried once again to make the Nile kingdom into the key that would unlock Jerusalem. But now Egypt had reversed the meaning of every earlier success. Damietta was no longer a proud foothold. It was a bargaining piece, The advance was no longer proof of courage. It was proof of overextension. The king's presence was no longer a guarantee of sacred momentum. It made the failure larger, because now a king could be lost with his army. Louis IX was captured. For medieval Europe, the capture of a crusading king was not merely a military incident. It was a spiritual and political shock. A king carried symbolic weight. His body was not just his body. It represented dynasty, authority, and divine responsibility. When such a ruler fell into enemy hands during a holy campaign, the meaning of the crusade itself became unstable. Was this a test? A punishment? A temporary humiliation before redemption? Or simply the result of bad decisions in a difficult country? Those questions mattered because medieval people did not separate events from meaning. A failed campaign demanded interpretation. Someone had to explain why God had allowed it. Someone had to decide whether the blame belonged to sin, pride, flawed leadership, insufficient unity, or the mysterious purposes of providence. And beneath all those explanations sat the cold material truth. An army had been beaten, a king was captive, and Egypt had not fallen. The ransom of Louis IX was enormous, not only in money, but in humiliation. Ransom was part of medieval war. Noble captives were valuable precisely because their lives could be converted into political and financial pressure. But when the captive is a crusading king in Egypt, ransom becomes a kind of verdict. The land that was supposed to be conquered now dictated the terms of release. The invaders who had hoped to command Egypt's future were forced to purchase their own. For the Templars, the aftermath carried a particular sting. They were not strangers to paying, negotiating, or managing the financial realities of war. The order's reputation in Europe would later become tangled with money and treasure. But in practice, money was one of the substances that allowed crusading to function at all. Fortresses needed funds. Horses needed replacement. Captives needed ransom. Ships, grain, armor, and garrisons all turned holy ideals into expensive commitments. The failure in Egypt made that expense visible. Every campaign consumes resources, but a failed campaign consumes them twice. First in the attempt, then in the recovery. Men must be ransomed, losses replaced, reputations repaired, alliances reassessed. The Templars had lost brothers and prestige at Mansurah. Now the wider Crusader movement lost confidence in the dream that Egypt could be easily turned into a solution. The order survived, but survival is not the same as escaping damage. Egypt had absorbed them. That is the word that seems most accurate. Not simply defeated, absorbed. It took the Crusader army into its waterways, its diseases, its delays, its urban traps, its negotiations, its ransom demands. It turned the invaders' own assumptions against them. It allowed them to enter, allowed them to win enough to continue, and then made the price of continuing unbearable. This pattern appears in both major Egyptian crusades. First, the Fifth Crusade took Damietta, refused a settlement, advanced too far, and surrendered the city to escape disaster. Then Louis IX's crusade took Damietta again, marched inward again, suffered at Mansurah, and collapsed into captivity and ransom. The details differ. The leadership differs. The circumstances are not identical, but the shape is difficult to ignore. Entry, confidence, overreach, compression, negotiation. withdrawal. That shape is the real architecture beneath the legend. Later stories would imagine the Templars discovering hidden knowledge in Egypt. But if we ask what Egypt truly revealed to them, Captivity and Ransom give one of the clearest answers. Egypt revealed that Crusader power had limits so hard they could be priced. It revealed that a sacred army could become a debtor. It revealed that a king could kneel not in ceremony, but in necessity. There is no need to exaggerate the humiliation. The facts are severe enough. Louis IX did not stop being respected because he failed in Egypt. In some ways, his personal piety and endurance deepened his reputation among many Christians. Medieval admiration could survive military disaster if the sufferer appeared holy enough. But strategic failure remained strategic failure. Egypt was not conquered. Jerusalem was not secured. The campaign that had promised transformation ended by proving again that the road through the Delta was lined with traps more durable than enthusiasm. For the Templars, this meant returning to the long work of survival. The order had to continue defending what remained. It had to maintain castles, advise, fight, collect revenues, and operate within the shrinking possibilities of the Crusader states. Egypt had not given them treasure. It had given them memory. And memory can be a burden when it repeats a warning nobody wants to hear. The price of failure was not only paid in ransom, it was paid in the erosion of a belief. The belief that one massive crusade, led with enough devotion, wealth, and courage, could break the Eastern Mediterranean open and restore the old dream by force. Egypt did not make that belief disappear overnight. Ideas tied to salvation do not die easily, but it damaged the belief. It forced even the most committed minds to confront the difference between holy purpose and strategic capacity. That difference is where much of the Templar mystery lives. Because when an institution is admired, feared, and later destroyed, people struggle to accept ordinary explanations. They do not want to hear that its great secrets were supply lines, debts, negotiations, defeats, and institutional memory. They want symbols. They want hidden chambers. They want a reason worthy of the aura that gathered around the order. But the Egypt campaigns suggest something less decorative and more profound. The Templars saw crusading power stripped down to its essentials. They saw that banners could be captured by mud, that kings could be made captives, that cities could become liabilities, and that the enemy was capable of patience, adaptation, and political intelligence. They saw that holy war, when carried into the wrong conditions, could become a machine for producing ransom. And perhaps that is why Egypt held such force in the imagination afterward. It did not reveal itself as a conquerable prize. It revealed itself as a country with enough depth to survive invasion and make invasion answer for itself. The Crusaders came looking for the key to Jerusalem. What they found was a lock that broke the hands trying to turn it. Louis IX would leave captivity. Damietta would be surrendered. The army would withdraw from the immediate disaster. But the failure remained, not as one lost battle, not as one tragic mistake, but as a lesson written across 2 generations of crusading ambition. Egypt could be entered by force, but it could not be possessed by desire. Chapter 13. The Temptation of Hidden Knowledge. Only after the armies fail does the other Egypt begin to appear. Not the Egypt of mud, fever, ransom, and difficult river crossings. Not the Egypt of Damietta and Mansurah, where Crusader confidence found itself tangled in the practical world. A different Egypt. Older, darker, more convenient to the imagination. The Egypt of sealed chambers, lost sciences, forbidden diagrams, sacred relics, and wisdom hidden beneath sound until the right men came looking. This is the Egypt that later legend gave to the Templars, and it is easy to understand why. The Knights Templar were already perfect material for mystery. They were religious but armed, wealthy but sworn to poverty, publicly powerful but internally disciplined, admired, resented, and feared. Their sudden suppression in the early 14th century left behind accusations, fragments, silences, and questions that later writers could stretch into almost any shape. Then add Egypt. Egypt had antiquity on a scale medieval Europe could scarcely domesticate. It carried biblical memory, pagan memory, imperial memory, and monumental remains that seemed to outlast every explanation placed upon them. Even when people did not understand the old inscriptions or the full history of the ancient dynasties, they could still feel that Egypt belonged to a time deeper than ordinary history. It looked like a land that should contain secrets. So when later centuries imagined the Templars in Egypt, they did not usually imagine tired men in a camp negotiating food and ransom. They imagined discovery. Perhaps, the story goes, the Templars found ancient Egyptian wisdom. Perhaps they encountered occult teachings preserved from the age of Pharaoh. Perhaps they found sacred relics connected to biblical history. Perhaps they learned hidden architecture, secret astronomy, forbidden theology, or codes that later shaped their rituals. Perhaps their wealth came not only from donations and estates, but from treasure recovered in the East. The word perhaps does an enormous amount of work in these stories. It creates atmosphere without evidence. It allows a claim to hover just above responsibility. It invites the listener to step into a fog where absence becomes almost as suggestive as proof. And because the Templars really were secretive in some aspects of internal life, and because Egypt really was ancient, the legend begins to feel emotionally plausible even when the documentary foundation is thin. But emotional plausibility is not the same as history. What can be documented with more confidence is that the Templars participated in military campaigns in Egypt, suffered losses there, and became part of the crusading struggle over Damietta, Mansurah, and the wider strategy of controlling the Holy Land through Egypt. What cannot be shown with comparable confidence is that they recovered occult Egyptian archives, hidden treasure, or relics that transformed the order's inner doctrine. The evidence is thinner there, much thinner. That does not mean every legend was invented from nothing in a single cynical moment. Legends rarely grow that way. More often, they form around real features that become exaggerated. The Templars were wealthy, so wealth became treasure. They had internal rights, so discipline became secrecy. They fought in the East, so contact became initiation. They entered Egypt, so military experience became ancient revelation. Each step is small enough to seem harmless. Together, they build a myth. The temptation of hidden knowledge also says something about us, not only about them. People often prefer secret causes to ordinary ones. If an order becomes rich, perhaps it found treasure. If it becomes powerful, perhaps it knows forbidden truths. If it is destroyed suddenly, perhaps someone wanted to silence it. These explanations feel satisfying because they turn the mess of history into a plot. But history is usually untidier. The Templars became wealthy through donations, privileges, land holding, financial services, and their role within the crusading movement. They became powerful because they were organized, useful, disciplined, and international. They were destroyed for reasons tied to politics, debt, royal pressure, suspicion, and the vulnerability of a military order after the Crusader cause had weakened. None of this requires an Egyptian secret buried beneath the story. And yet, the myth persists because it answers an emotional need that plain explanation does not. It makes failure meaningful. The Egyptian campaigns were humiliating. The Crusaders entered with sacred ambition and left with surrender, ransom, and loss. The Templars, who later became surrounded by rumors of extraordinary knowledge, had in Egypt encountered something painfully ordinary: the limits of force. For later imaginations, that may have been too severe. Better to believe they found something hidden. Better to believe the desert gave them a secret compensation for defeat. There is also a kind of narrative justice in these inventions. If Egypt defeated the Crusaders militarily, perhaps it rewarded the most mysterious among them spiritually. If the Templars could not conquer the land, perhaps they penetrated its secrets. It is a beautiful reversal. It is also a suspiciously convenient one. A careful storyteller has to pause here, because not all mystery is false, but not all mystery is evidence. The past contains real gaps. Documents are missing. Motives are unclear. Private conversations vanished the moment they ended. The inner experiences of men who fought in Egypt are largely beyond recovery. We should not pretend to know everything, but we should also not fill every silence with treasure. The more responsible question is not, what secret must the Templars have found? It is, why did later centuries need them to have found one? That question leads us closer to the truth of the legend. Egypt became a canvas because it could hold almost any projection. The Templars became the figures painted onto it because their actual history was dramatic enough to make invention feel unnecessary and incomplete enough to make invention easy. This is how myth attaches itself to history, not by replacing fact entirely, but by growing in the spaces fact leaves unguarded. The armed monks who entered Egypt were not archaeologists of forbidden wisdom. They were participants in crusading war. They saw cities, canals, fortifications, negotiations, hunger, discipline, and death. They saw opponents who understood the land better than they did. They saw the Nile make strategy humble. That is what the record most securely gives us. The hidden knowledge, if we use the phrase carefully, was not a cult. It was the knowledge that Egypt could not be reduced to a symbol in someone else's holy drama. It was a living power, not a stage prop. It did not exist to confirm Crusader destiny or provide a secret prize for later storytellers. It resisted, absorbed, bargained, and endured. Still, one can see why the legends grew. There is something almost unbearable about a mystery that ends in logistics. So imagination reopens the sealed door. It places a chamber beneath the sand. It puts a relic on a stone table, a scroll in a hidden niche, a secret carried back across the sea by men who never spoke of it. The picture is powerful, but power is not proof. And in the story of the Templars and Egypt, that distinction is the line between investigation and fantasy. Chapter 14. From Military Memory to Secret Legend. The Templars did not become legendary because they were unknown. They became legendary because they were known just enough. That is the strange fuel behind their afterlife. A completely obscure order would not have attracted the same hunger. A fully transparent one would have left less room for invention. The Templars stood in the dangerous middle. They were visible across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, wealthy enough to be resented, disciplined enough to be feared, religious enough to be judged harshly, and secretive enough in their internal life for outsiders to imagine almost anything. Then they fell, and sudden falls produce echoes. When the order was suppressed in the early 14th century, its reputation did not die cleanly with its institutions. It broke apart and drifted. Some pieces became legal memory, some became political warning, some became devotional embarrassment, and some became legend. Accusations, rumors, forced confessions, missing records, vanished properties, and the sheer drama of a powerful religious military order being dismantled all created an atmosphere where later writers could ask, what were they hiding? Egypt made the question more seductive. By then, Egypt was not merely a place where Crusader armies had failed. In the imagination, it had become a storehouse of depth. The land seemed older than ordinary explanation. Its monuments appeared to belong to a civilization that had touched the edge of forbidden wisdom, even when those ideas came more from later fantasy than from careful historical knowledge. Place the Templars in that landscape, and the combination almost writes its own rumor. Armed monks, ancient land, lost battles, sudden suppression, wealth, silence. The ingredients were too strong to remain unused, but military memory probably came first. Before the occult Egypt of later speculation, there was the remembered Egypt of campaign experience. Damietta, Mansurah, the Nile, hunger, flooding, the capture of a king, the loss of brothers. Those memories would have circulated inside Crusader culture as warnings, explanations, and scars. They did not need to be written as secret doctrine to matter. Institutions remember through habits, through caution, through the stories veterans tell younger men when maps are opened and plans begin to sound too confident. Over time, however, memory can harden into symbol. Egypt became the place where Crusader ambition had been tested and found wanting. For the Templars, whose identity was tied to the defense of the Holy Land, that failure was not just military. It touched the meaning of their existence. They had entered the land believed to be the key behind Jerusalem, and they had not unlocked it. Twice, great efforts had ended in loss, ransom, and withdrawal. That kind of defeat leaves a vacuum. Legend often enters through such vacuums. It supplies pattern where history leaves pain. It offers secret victory where the record shows public failure. It gives hidden meaning to events that otherwise look like waste. If the Templars did not conquer Egypt, perhaps they learned from it. If they did not master its armies, perhaps they mastered its mysteries. If their order later collapsed under accusation and pressure, perhaps the true cause was not politics or fear, but knowledge too dangerous to survive. The story becomes cleaner, and therefore less true. What makes this transformation so persistent is that it does not feel completely disconnected from reality. The Templars really were wealthy. They really did operate across borders. They really did possess internal procedures not open to ordinary laypeople. They really were present in the East. They really were involved in campaigns where documentation is incomplete. Egypt really did possess an ancient aura that invited speculation. The myth does not invent the stage. It changes the play. This is why careful interpretation matters. To say that later legends exaggerated the Templar-Egypt connection is not to strip the story of mystery. It is to relocate the mystery where it belongs. The real mystery is not a hidden relic waiting beneath a vanished floor. The real mystery is how historical memory transforms humiliation into secret prestige. That transformation tells us a great deal about later centuries. People looked back at the Templars and saw what they needed: martyrs, heretics, bankers, warriors, victims, conspirators, guardians of wisdom, enemies of kings, or ancestors of secret societies. The same order could be made to wear many masks, because its end was violent enough, and its records broken enough to support competing fantasies. Egypt became one of the deepest masks, because it allowed the story to reach back beyond the Middle Ages into antiquity itself. A failed crusade became a doorway into imagined ancient knowledge. There is a quiet irony here. The Templars' actual Egyptian experience likely taught them about limits. The limits of cavalry, vows, strategy, and imported certainty. Later legend turned that lesson into its opposite. Instead of Egypt humbling the order, Egypt secretly elevated it. Instead of the land exposing Crusader weakness, it supposedly granted privileged insight. Instead of defeat, initiation. This reversal is emotionally satisfying. It is also historically suspect. The more grounded account is not less powerful. In fact, it may be more unsettling. The Templars did not need to bring back occult wisdom for Egypt to change them. They brought back memory of a land that could not be forced into Crusader designs. They brought back evidence that Muslim political and military systems were not fragile obstacles waiting for a final shove. They brought back the knowledge that an army could win the beginning of a campaign and lose the meaning of it by the end. But memory is quiet. Legend speaks louder. By the time later writers inherited the Templar story, the military details could be rearranged into something more marketable to the imagination. A canal became a path to a hidden sanctuary. A rumor became a clue. Institutional secrecy became proof of forbidden doctrine. The absence of evidence became not a limitation, but an invitation. That is how historical gaps become legends. Not because everyone involved is foolish, and not because mystery has no place in history. Gaps are real. The past is damaged. Records vanish. Victors edit. Losers defend themselves. Institutions conceal. Witnesses misunderstand. The problem begins when a gap is treated as a container for whatever story we most want to find. The Templars' Egypt is full of such gaps. What did individual brothers say after Mansurah? What private warnings circulated before later campaigns? How did the order internally interpret the failure of Egyptian strategy? Which memories were preserved, which were suppressed, and which simply faded because no one thought them worth recording? These are honest questions. They are not proof of hidden treasure. And perhaps that is the discipline this story asks of us. To let uncertainty remain uncertain. To resist the urge to decorate every silence. To understand that the unknown is not automatically a vault. Egypt remained powerful in the Templar imagination because it contained both fact and suggestion. The campaigns happened. The failures happened. The order's secrecy was real enough. Its suppression was dramatic enough. The later myths were imaginative enough. Between them lies the shadowed territory where history becomes legend, not in one leap, but by slow accumulation. A military memory becomes a rumor becomes a symbol becomes a secret. And after enough time has passed, people begin to mistake the secret for the original event. Chapter 15. The real treasure of Egypt. So what did the Templars find in Egypt? If we strip away the later decorations, The answer is not as glamorous as legend wants it to be. There is no secure evidence that they discovered a hidden chamber of ancient wisdom. No proven relic carried out of the Delta under guard. No lost Egyptian archive that remade their order from within. What they found was more severe. They found the edge of crusading power. That may not sound like treasure, but for an institution built around holy war, it was knowledge of the most dangerous kind. The Templars had entered Egypt as part of campaigns that believed the land could be used, seized, traded, or mastered. Egypt was imagined as the key behind Jerusalem, the great source of wealth and force that, if broken, might make the Holy Land secure. Instead, Egypt showed them how thin that imagination could be. It showed them that a crusading army could take a city and still fail to control the campaign. It showed them that courage could become waste when separated from timing. It showed them that kings could be captured, elite fighters could be destroyed in streets, and sacred ambition could end in ransom negotiations. That was the real treasure, a hard knowledge of limits. Every age has trouble respecting limits. Medieval crusaders were not unique in this. Empires, kingdoms, republics, and modern states have all made the same mistake in different uniforms. They look at a map and see lines, targets, routes, and objectives. They forget that places are not flat surfaces waiting for strategy to be written upon them. Places have memory. They have weather, water, food systems, loyalties, rivalries, habits of defense, and ways of absorbing outsiders who think arrival is the same as understanding. Egypt was especially gifted at this kind of correction. Its strength was not only in armies, though armies mattered. It was in continuity. The Nile gave wealth, but it also demanded knowledge. The Delta offered roots, but also confusion. Cities offered prizes, but also traps. Diplomacy offered openings, but also delays. Egypt could seem vulnerable at the edge and remain powerful at the center. That is why the Crusaders kept mistaking the first step for the whole journey. Damietta fell, and the future seemed to open. Mansurah beckoned, and glory seemed near. Jerusalem could be discussed, and destiny seemed almost negotiable. But each apparent opening led into a more complicated reality. The Crusaders were not defeated by one thing. They were defeated by the combination of many things working together: geography, strategy, disease, supply, political patience, and their own inability to stop when stopping might still have saved them. The Templars, because they were disciplined, may have understood parts of this more clearly than others. But they were not outside history. They were caught inside the same machinery of vows, pressure, reputation, and sacred expectation. Their experience did not make them immune to the crusading dream. It only made their collision with reality more painful. And this is where the story becomes quietly tragic. The Templars were among the most serious warriors of the crusading world. They were not casual adventurers chasing a rumor. They were trained, organized, and committed. If any group should have been able to turn hard experience into durable strategy, it was an order like theirs. Yet Egypt revealed that even discipline cannot rescue an idea that has grown too large for its conditions. The crusading movement wanted Egypt to be the solution. Egypt refused to play that role. It did not reveal itself as a passive treasure house, waiting for armed monks to carry away its secrets. It revealed itself as a civilization with its own intelligence, its own resilience, and its own command of place. It forced the invaders to learn that Muslim power in the Eastern Mediterranean was not an accident of possession, but a structure of resources, leadership, adaptation, and survival. This is what later myths often avoid. They turn Egypt into an object, a vault, a tomb, a source of hidden doctrine. But in the actual campaigns, Egypt was a subject. It acted, it responded, it negotiated, it punished, it endured. The Crusaders did not simply project their ambitions onto Egypt and receive an answer from the past. They met living opponents who knew how to use the present. That distinction matters, because when we ask what the Templars found, we are also asking what kind of history we want. Do we want history as a puzzle box, where every failure hides a secret reward? Or can we accept history as a place where human beings often discover uncomfortable truths and then spend centuries disguising them as something more flattering? The real treasure of Egypt was not gold, it was disillusionment. Not the shallow kind that merely says, "The Crusaders were wrong," and leaves it there. A deeper disillusionment. The kind that tears away a story people have told themselves about destiny. The kind that reveals how fragile holy war becomes when its sacred confidence meets rivers, hunger, divided leadership, and an enemy who refuses to behave like a symbol. For the Templars, this knowledge must have been difficult to carry. Their order existed because the crusading project still demanded defenders. They could not simply announce that the dream had failed. They had castles to hold, routes to guard, prisoners to ransom, estates to manage, and brothers to replace. Institutions rarely confess their deepest lessons openly. They convert them into policy, caution, silence, or stubborn repetition. And after Egypt, repetition remained possible. That is perhaps the most haunting lesson of all. People can know the cost and still return to the desire. They can remember the flood, the hunger, the lost brothers, the captured king, and still believe that next time the door will open differently. History does not repeat because nobody learned. Sometimes it repeats because what was learned was not strong enough to overcome what was wanted. The Templars' Egyptian experience sits exactly there, between knowledge and desire. They learned that Egypt was not merely the road to Jerusalem. They learned it was a power in its own right. They learned that strategy without humility becomes a form of blindness. They learned that a sacred cause does not cancel the ordinary rules by which armies survive. But later centuries wanted another treasure. They wanted the Templars to have found something hidden because hidden treasure feels more satisfying than visible failure. It gives defeat a secret compensation. It lets us imagine that the Order did not merely lose men and campaigns, but gained forbidden insight in return. It turns humiliation into initiation. Yet the harder truth is more useful. Egypt did not make the Templars mysterious by giving them a secret. It made them mysterious by defeating them so completely that later imagination could not leave the defeat alone. Chapter 16. The Sand Keeps Its Secrets. Egypt remains powerful in the Templar imagination because it did not give the Order a clean ending. It defeated them, but not in a way that satisfied the storyteller's hunger for drama. There was no single door thrown open, no final chamber revealed, no ancient voice explaining the meaning of it all. There were sieges, canals, illness, broken advances, negotiations, ransom, and retreat. There was the slow humiliation of serious men discovering that seriousness is not the same as mastery. And perhaps that is why the legends survived. A clean defeat can be filed away. A strange defeat keeps asking to be explained. The Templars entered Egypt as part of a crusading vision that believed the road to Jerusalem might run through the Nile. What they found was a country too deep to be reduced to a stepping stone. Egypt did not merely block them. It absorbed their plans, bent their confidence, and left behind just enough silence for later centuries to wonder what else had happened there. That silence became fertile. Into it, people placed treasure. They placed relics. They placed secret doctrines, ancient wisdom, hidden maps, and forbidden rites. The less the evidence could prove, the more imagination felt invited to complete the scene. And the Templars, with their wealth, discipline, secrecy, and violent end, became perfect vessels for stories that wanted history to contain a locked compartment. But the greatest mystery may not be what they found. It may be why later centuries needed them to have found something. Maybe failure felt too ordinary. Maybe logistics seemed too dull. Maybe the image of armed monks humbled by water, hunger, politics, and local knowledge was too uncomfortable. So the story was rewritten in the language of secrets. Defeat became initiation. Military memory became hidden wisdom. Egypt became not the land that exposed Crusader limits, but the land that supposedly gave the Templars their deeper power. Yet the record points us back to a harder conclusion. The Templars' real encounter with Egypt was not a triumph concealed beneath myth. It was a lesson in the fragility of holy war when it meets geography, administration, and time. They saw that faith could inspire endurance, but not feed an army by itself. They saw that courage could win a street and lose a campaign. They saw that a captured city could become a burden, and a king could become a captive. That is not a small discovery. It is simply not the kind of discovery that glitters. Egypt keeps its secrets because history always keeps some secrets. We will never know every private fear, every council argument, every memory carried home by surviving brothers of the temple. We cannot stand beside them in the Delta and hear what they said when confidence thinned. We cannot open every lost letter or restore every vanished report. But we can see the shape of what remained. A land older than their order defeated them. A river older than their vows ignored them. A civilization they hoped to bend endured them. And from the space between fact and silence, myth began its patient work. So perhaps the door beneath the sand was never an entrance to a hidden vault. Perhaps it was the threshold between ambition and understanding. The Templars crossed it in armor, carrying the certainty of their age. They left with losses that later imagination would cover in gold. And Egypt, as it so often has, remained where it was. Immense, unreadable, and quietly stronger than the stories told about it.